Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasting.
This is not like her. We think that she is confused and scared. We're quite sure she doesn't know who she is. This is a terrifying thought for any parent or loved one to come to terms with. That someone they care about could forget who they are and not even realize that there are people out there who are desperately trying to find them and bring them home. But for the family of Patricia Meehan, this wasn't just a nightmare. It was a cold and brutal reality that began with a car accident in Circle, Montana on April 20th, 1989, and continues to this day. When a person goes missing, there's a special kind of pain in the not knowing. I want to tell you the stories of those who never came home. Today, I want to tell you the story of Patricia Meehan. I'm Conan Gallagher.
And I'm Ethan Flick.
And this is And Then They Were Gone. Welcome back, everyone.
Welcome back.
Thank you for joining us once again. I'm Kona.
And I'm Ethan.
And we're the husband and wife team behind this podcast. Each week, I tell you the story of an unsolved missing persons case. Ethan doesn't know anything about this case going into the episode, and he's here to provide his reactions and questions in real time, hopefully asking some of the same ones you have at home. So this story, I don't know about you, but it reminds me of Hannah Up, who we covered earlier this season. So Hannah Up was the one who went missing twice and was found
right
before finally going missing for a third time in the Virgin Islands.
Yeah.
In Hannah's case, she suffered from fugue states where she forgot her identity, but she was able to otherwise behave relatively normally. So like I said, she went missing twice, she showed up twice, and that's how doctors were kind of able to figure out what had been going on with her. Patty Meehan, on the other hand, only did this once and has never been found.
Okay.
So we can't be sure that that's what was happening.
Right.
But, as I was researching and writing this, I just kept on thinking about Hannah. So we can see, once we get into it, how similar or different you think the stories actually are.
Okay.
Before we get started, though, we've had some new members join us over on Patreon, so I want to give a shout out to Laura K., Rebecca, and Deborah H. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you all so much.
Remember, if you join us there on any level, starting at just $2 a month, you can get these episodes ad-free and also get a copy of the ebook that I wrote. So now with all that out of the way, let's get into the story of Patricia Meehan. Patricia Bernadette Meehan was born on November 1st, 1951 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to Dolly and Thomas Meehan. The daughter of a Pittsburgh firefighter, Patty grew up in a home deeply devoted to caring for others and the community around them. As Patty herself then became an adult, it was with that core belief in mind that she chose her own path, childcare. Patty eventually went on to study early childhood development at college in Oklahoma City, a choice that set her right on course to achieve her goal of helping children in need. But in 1985, when Patty was around 34 years old, she had a change of heart. Instead of working with children, Patty decided she wanted to devote her life to another one of her loves, animals. Patty had always loved horses, and it was from then on that she decided to change careers so that she could spend more time looking after them. To do that, she moved to Bozeman, Montana, where she could easily find work as a ranch hand during the summer, and then she just kind of did odd jobs during the winter to support herself. For those of you who aren't familiar with American geography, I just want to point out that Patty was very far away from her family.
Yeah.
Oklahoma City, where she went to school, is about 1,100 miles west of Pittsburgh, where she grew up. Bozeman is another 750 miles west of that, taking her nearly across the country and almost 2,000 miles away from most of her loved ones. So this move was absolutely a change and definitely an adventure. Away from the hustle and bustle of life in Pittsburgh, Patty could spend her days around the animals that she loved and get out in the open air. And this is how she spent the next 3 years of her life. She lived, she worked, and felt completely free and at peace with the direction her life had gone. But in the spring of 1989, something changed. The summer months usually made her happy, giving her beautiful days on the ranch with the horses, but Patty was restless. And, her mom later talked about this. Patty was in her late 30s at the time, and she was 37. And I think the fact that she hadn't married and had children was starting to weigh on her. Her mom had said that she had started to feel as though that was something she had kind of missed out on. There was a lot of other stuff going on, but that is one thing that, her mom did mention. But of course, being 2,000 miles away, we don't know what the whole extent of everything was. But on April 19th, 1989, Patty's landlord stopped by to talk to her. And he would later say that she seemed agitated and flighty, which was very unusual for her. It was shortly after that Patty called home and spoke to her father, Tom, who was by then a retired firefighter. Patty told Tom that she had been struggling with her mental health. She said that she'd been feeling stressed and overwhelmed, and she wanted to come home. Patty's parents agreed to take her in, but only after she'd spoken to a psychiatrist about the way she'd been feeling. So, they obviously were very supportive. They were fine with her coming back to Pittsburgh, but they just wanted her to maybe deal with whatever was going on first before she made such a rash decision and kind of uprooted her whole life, you know?
I was just going to say, it's not like this is a decision where a college kid is coming home. This is, a grown woman living 2,000 miles away from Pittsburgh who had a life in Montana, and to uproot yourself it's a pretty big deal.
It is. And they were perfectly willing for her to do that. But I think they just wanted to make sure that it's what she truly wanted.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just she was going through something and she would be fine and she'd regret moving back.
Right.
So Patty agreed with them, and she actually made an appointment to see a therapist the following day. But unfortunately, she never made it to that appointment. On the evening of April 20th, 1989, Peggy Bueller and her father were driving along a dark stretch of road near Circle, Montana, which is nearly 400 miles away from Bozeman, where Patty lived. Suddenly, they saw headlights coming straight toward them. Thankfully, Peggy managed to swerve in time to avoid hitting the vehicle head-on. Unfortunately, there was another car behind them. After Peggy swerved, Carol Heights, who was driving the car behind her, was faced with this other vehicle coming straight toward her, and she did not have enough time to swerve out of the way, and the two cars collided. Now, Carol happened to be an off-duty police dispatcher. So after the accident, she climbed out of her vehicle. She was injured, but, alive. She was able to walk and all that. But she was dazed and in shock over what had just happened. So as she stood there out in the dark in the middle of nowhere, basically, she then watched another woman climb out of the car that had just hit hers. The woman with strawberry blonde hair and grayish green eyes seemed just as dazed and confused as Carol was. But, Carol kind of got it together first. She asked the woman if she was okay, but the woman just looked straight through her. Then, without saying a word, the woman, the driver of the other car, climbed over a nearby fence and just stood in the field. So Patty Meehan's case was made famous by an episode of Unsolved Mysteries that aired not too long after her disappearance. And in that episode, Carol was interviewed, and she said, quote, "As I looked out across the accident, I noticed someone on the other side of the fence. She was standing there like a spectator, not like it had happened to her." End quote. By then, Peggy Bueller and her father, who'd pulled over after witnessing the crash, had made it on foot back to the scene. They then helped Carol make it safely the rest of the way out of her vehicle and over to the side of the road. And so Peggy and her father, just like Carol had, tried to talk to the other driver, but she didn't respond.
And at this point, she's just standing in a field on the other side of the fence.
Yeah, just like staring. After several minutes of observing the scene, the woman then turned around and started walking away into the prairie, into the prairie, not toward anything, just walked off. By then, it was dark, and it was clear to everyone at the crash site that this entire situation was both extremely strange and also maybe extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
Carol was already clearly injured, and if the other woman involved in the crash was injured as well, she was now walking away from where help would arrive. And also, this was 1989, so nobody was able to just pull out their phone and call 911. Knowing that they needed to take action sooner rather than later, Peggy's father stayed at the scene with Carol while Peggy drove into town to find a payphone. She was then able to inform the local police what had just happened and direct them toward the accident. Paramedics arrived and took Carol to the hospital, but the other driver involved in the crash was nowhere to be found. Though the woman may have seemed like a ghost at the time, police soon found out that she was very real. Within a half an hour, a search of her license plates revealed that this mysterious woman's identity was Patty Meehan. But what was Patty doing over 5 hours away from her home in the middle of nowhere when she had a psychiatrist appointment the next morning?
Yeah, so I was going to ask, what direction was this, 500 miles in the direction of Pittsburgh or?
Yeah, so Circle, Montana is just under 400 miles east of Bozeman. So toward Pittsburgh, but still extremely far away.
Right. Plus, I'm assuming that her psychiatrist appointment was in Bozeman.
Yeah.
Not anywhere in between Bozeman and Pittsburgh.
No, not at all. She had no reason to be going anywhere that night. But, at this point, when paramedics and officers are there, they didn't know anything about Patty or her appointment or, that she had no reason to be on the road. They probably assumed that she was either drunk or had sustained a head injury in the accident or both.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that would be my first impression given the way she was acting.
Exactly.
Oh, head injury.
Yeah. So they set off into the prairie where she was last seen to find her. Now, when they started to look, they did find tennis shoe tracks that matched the type of shoe that Patty had been wearing. And they were able to follow them for about 3/4 of a mile. But then they disappeared.
This is some creepy stuff.
You can see why it was in the OG 1990 Unsolved Mysteries. Right?
Yeah, for sure. Because I'm sure that I can just hear Robert Stack saying was it a mysterious aliens? They came down and you know what I mean? Yeah. This is just, it's so creepy.
It is. No, it's terrible. The search continued into the dead of night and through rough terrain until the investigators lost the trail at about 3 a.m. They were then forced to give up the chase and wait until sunlight to pick up where they had left off. Honestly, I'm surprised they went that long.
Yeah.
Till 3.
Yeah.
But, good for them. After the next day's search turned up no sign of Patty, investigators began to realize that this was much more serious than someone who was running from a possible DUI, which I think, could have been another scenario, right?
Sure.
Because they knew who the car belonged to, police were able to notify Patty's family about what had happened. Patty hadn't gotten into contact with any of them, so, they had no idea what was going on. So they immediately went to Montana and began distributing missing persons flyers and putting up posters with information about Patty. Everyone wanted to find her and everyone wanted to bring her home safe and sound. As concern grew for Patty's safety, volunteers took to the local mountains. Searchers went out on horseback and ATVs. Patty's family even hired a helicopter to search the area from the skies, but Patty was nowhere to be seen. And then there came a troubling revelation. The countryside that Patty had disappeared into was littered with old and abandoned coal mines.
Oh, geez, really?
Yeah. It was possible that Patty had entered one of these tunnels looking for shelter, and it was entirely possible that she was still in one, either trapped or injured or worse. Hundreds of volunteers searched miles of treacherous tunnels, but yet again, Patty was nowhere to be found. With the sheer amount of time and effort that was being put into bringing Patty home, it seemed highly unlikely that she would just have no idea that her family and the community were out there looking for her. Even with concerns over her mental health, it also didn't make sense to law enforcement that Patty wouldn't approach any of the search parties or even turn herself into a police station. So one of the early theories was that perhaps Patty was trying to end her own life. And it wasn't a car accident, right? Like she had done it on purpose. But after the search kicked off and, everything became so intense, nobody really believed that she would just like stay in hiding because of embarrassment or whatever,
Yeah. Yeah, that just doesn't make sense.
Right. So that didn't make any sense. Unless, they argued, she had been more severely injured in the crash than they had initially thought.
Which is a very good possibility.
The investigators came up with a theory that Patty was suffering from amnesia as a result of the crash. Now, not only was she potentially dazed and confused as a direct result of her injuries, but maybe she had also forgotten who she was. She potentially had no idea that the search parties out there were actually looking for her and not someone else. And she potentially could have believed that the search parties were there to hurt her and not help her. So this whole amnesia theory, which is a major theory in this case, there are a lot of naysayers online, and I get it because I think that amnesia in situations like this is often portrayed like in the soap opera kind of way, where it's like a plot device and, you just like forget who you are and whatever. But again, going back to the Hannah Up story, it's wild to me how that worked out. And this is very much like that, where she was walking through New York, did not know who she was aware of searchers, like people looking for her, but like didn't realize they were looking for her, but just instinctually felt like she wanted to avoid them.
Right. Yeah, because she kept running away from the police who were looking for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just find that interesting that her like natural inclination was to hide. Mm-hmm. And so, when you read this about Patty, which happened many years before Hannah's story, like it kind of sounds similar. So this amnesia theory would explain why Patty had avoided detection so far. And it was an explanation that her family, began to believe themselves. The Patty that they knew was warm and kind and wouldn't have willingly put them through the grief and worry of not knowing what had happened to her. She also wouldn't have shied away from asking for help, just like she hadn't when she asked her parents if she could move back in with them, or had called the therapist to make an appointment. This isn't a woman who was like in denial about things. To the Meehans and the investigators, for that matter, the only possible reason why Patty wouldn't have come home to them was that she couldn't. And in this case, it was that she simply couldn't remember that they were there for her. Believing this, the family then took to the public to ask for their help to find their missing daughter. And that's when the sightings began. On May 4th, 1989, 2 weeks after the crash, a police officer in Luverne, Minnesota, 670 miles east of the crash site, interviewed a woman sitting in a Hardee's restaurant. She had strawberry blonde hair and appeared to be the same age as Patty Meehan. She had also been acting strangely. The officer had first noticed the woman sitting on her own in a booth at a restaurant drinking a glass of water. According to the waitress, the woman had been there by herself drinking water for 5 hours.
Whoa.
Yeah. And the restaurant was closing up, so the waitress was like, okay, like, you gotta go. So as soon as she left, she went basically across the street to another diner that was open 24/7 and just sat down there. So the cop was in the first diner and was just kind of keeping an eye on this. I think he just like happened to be there,
Yeah.
and then like watched her walk across to this other diner and followed her because he didn't know what was going on with this lady. He didn't recognize her, as Patty necessarily, but he was like, something's going on, he was just going to go check it out.
Mm-hmm.
So he approached her and asked to see some identification. The woman refused to give the officer any information or even her name. After going back and forth with each other, she claimed that she had just come from Colorado before saying she was actually from Israel. So remember, in the U.S., if a cop asks you for your ID, you do not have to produce it, as long as you're not driving a vehicle, or there are other specific instances. So this woman hadn't actually done anything wrong and wouldn't tell the officer her name so that they could run it through the system or anything like that. So she just left. And it's still unclear whether this woman was in fact Patty, but many believe that it was.
And so she said she was she came from Colorado, but was originally from Israel.
Yeah.
See, I'm starting to think,
Lawrence Bader.
Yeah, because he had created a whole different identity.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was starting to think that maybe it was close to that.
Yeah. Well, it very well could have been. The next day, 2 more sightings came in, both in South Dakota. It was in Sioux Falls that a waitress claimed that a woman matching Patty's description sat in a diner drinking coffee for about 12 hours before she disappeared.
Dude, how many bathroom trips is drinking water for 5 hours, drinking coffee for 12 hours?
I know.
Good God.
Yeah. Then a woman matching Patty's description was seen sitting in another diner, this time in neighboring Murdo, South Dakota. But she wasn't alone. At this diner, the woman believed to be Patty was with a man who seemed to be in his 30s. They stayed in the diner for about an hour before leaving together.
Okay.
Now remember, the first sighting in Minnesota was over 600 miles east of where Patty crashed her car. So we're already talking 1,000 miles east of Bozeman, where she lived.
Yeah.
But these new sightings had her heading west, potentially back toward her home in Bozeman. And it was, in fact, in Bozeman that the next potential sighting of Patty came. This sighting was on May 19th, almost a month after the car crash, and 2 weeks after the South Dakota sighting. So 2 weeks of nothing, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then Bozeman, Montana on May 19th. This time, another waitress at a restaurant in Bozeman claimed to have seen her. She said that Patty had told her she was in a rush. So she had come in and ordered breakfast and said hey, I'm in a rush. Can it be done soon? Will I be able to get out of here quickly? It was shortly before 9 a.m., so the waitress assumed that the customer had to get to work, and that's why she was in a hurry. So, she's just making small talk. She's oh yeah, it'll be out in, a couple minutes. You'll be fine, blah, blah, blah. And, said something about her or asked her about going to work. And she said, no, I need to leave so I can go shopping.
Okay.
Which obviously stuck out to the waitress.
Yeah, it's very odd.
Yeah. She then quickly ate her breakfast and disappeared, but not before making an impression on the staff at the restaurant, as you can imagine. Another waitress working that morning recalled that the woman matching Patty's description seemed disoriented. Throughout the short stay, where the woman had quickly eaten her breakfast and then left, the second waitress had caught the woman talking to herself on several occasions. After these sightings were reported, Patty's family came to Montana armed with a videotape of Patty, which I really liked that idea. Because, this is 1989. And so it's not like now where you can just go to somebody's social media and find
pull
videos.
Pictures and
videos.
Yeah.
So they had photos of her or whatever.
Right.
But it's so much easier to identify somebody if you can see a video of them as opposed to a picture.
And hear their voice.
Exactly. You can hear them. You can see their mannerisms. You can see how they move. And,
right.
It's just such a much better way of identifying someone. So the waitresses watched the video that Patty's family had and they're oh yeah, that's definitely her.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. A few more sightings came in, but these were less solid, including one where someone who matched Patty's description was seen at a horse auction in Billings, Montana.
Well, horses, right?
Exactly.
She took care of horses.
Mm-hmm. But if it seemed as though Patty was in Montana to make her way home, that quickly proved to not be the case. 2 weeks later, a woman with strawberry blonde hair was spotted walking along the side of the interstate in Washington state.
Oh.
So now she's made it even further completely over to the West Coast. There's nothing but open country for miles around, and so when a truck driver spotted the woman walking on the side of the road, he pulled over and offered her a lift. The woman refused the offer, and when stopped again by a passing female driver, she told the woman that her car had broken down and she was on her way to find a payphone.
Okay.
The woman did match Patty's description, but she was over 600 miles away from her home in Bozeman and over 740 miles away from where she had potentially been spotted at the horse auction in Billings. So I do find that interesting, because it would seem like, based on the miles she had been covering, that the only way for her to have really done that was hitchhiking.
Yeah.
And, one of the sightings in North Dakota was at a truck stop. So, that makes sense. But then I find it weird that in Washington, she wasn't taking rides from two people who offered them to her.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so why Washington State? It may not have been completely random. Patty had a sister that had lived in Seattle until the year before, and an ex-boyfriend who still lived in Spokane. Was it possible that she was trying to go see one of them? If Patty had been suffering from amnesia from the crash, this could suggest that she had potentially started to remember bits and pieces of her life, and that something was driving her toward people who she knew.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that would also make sense as to why she ended up in Bozeman again.
Well, exactly, right? Yeah.
She just felt as though she needed to be going in that direction.
Yeah. And then, maybe she got there, that didn't feel right. And so she kind of just kept on searching.
Yeah.
About a week after Patty was potentially seen on the side of the road in Washington, she was spotted in Tacoma. An employee at the port of Tacoma reported seeing a woman matching Patty's description at a truck stop, asking people for directions to Aberdeen. Again, these are all cities in Washington. Ron Dorsum, the witness, told police that this incident had been highly unusual because the woman just wasn't going up to people at the truck stop asking for directions to Aberdeen. She was shouting at moving cars, asking where the 101 was.
Oh boy.
Yeah. In a few short months, over 25 potential sightings of Patty were reported, 3 of which were confirmed by police. But even though Patty was seemingly popping up all over the place, she never attempted to contact anyone in her life, and she remained elusive. It wasn't until almost a year later that police believed that they had finally found Patty and actually hung on to her.
Oh.
On August 30th, 1990, an officer in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, spotted a woman sitting in, you guessed it,
a diner?
Yep. Now, this officer was familiar with Patty's case and thought that the woman bore a striking resemblance to the missing Montana woman. He followed her outside, and when she threw a newspaper on the ground, he arrested her for littering.
Clever. I like it.
Yeah, and, generally I'm not in favor of police abusing power like that. But in this case,
it's a good way to keep her at his location.
Exactly. Lieutenant Greg Surplus told reporters, quote, "I really think it's her. This woman is the spitting image of Meehan," end quote. And that wasn't even the officer who made the arrest. This was his boss. This was his lieutenant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So multiple people at the police department were holy shit, we just saw this case.
Yeah.
Now, the woman, when she was brought into custody, didn't give much information for the investigators to work with, but she did tell them that she was a traveling missionary and that her name was Morningstar.
Okay.
Both Patty's ex-boyfriend, the one who lived in Washington, and Patty's parents spoke to the woman on the phone. All 3 of them said that she wasn't Patty.
Interesting.
And I didn't get the exact quote, but the boyfriend said something it really looks a lot like her, and it sounds kind of like her, but it doesn't really sound like her. And then her parents are yeah, no, it's not her. But after speaking to her on the phone.
Right. So they didn't have any any visual confirmation.
I mean, I think there were photos, I think like booking photos or whatever. But no, not like, it doesn't seem like any of them saw her in person.
That's interesting.
I think it's really interesting. And let me tell you why. When you read about this case, whether it's, different missing persons websites or like even the Wikipedia, right? It's repeated often that this woman was fingerprinted and was officially ruled out as Patty, like, after her parents said that they didn't think it was her. But I couldn't actually find an original source that stated that.
Oh.
So, like, the newspaper articles that were cited in that, I went back and read, and they don't say anything about fingerprinting.
So it's just assumed that after the phone calls with her ex-boyfriend and her parents, and they both said, no, that's not her, police just kicked her loose?
Well, kind of, but not quite. But this is why it's weird. Okay, so that all happened. So she was arrested on August 30th, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the littering charge, of course, was dismissed.
Sure.
But the woman remained in custody on a protective order after she was examined by a judge and was found to not be mentally competent.
Okay.
Then on September 16th, so over 2 weeks after her arrest and after like they had already come out and said, no, this isn't Patty, there's another article in Deseret News that states that officials tried to have the woman committed to the state health and welfare department, again, just because of her not being competent. But the judge denied the request, stating that there was no reason to believe the woman was, quote, mentally ill and likely to injure herself or was gravely disabled, end quote. So I guess, that's the standard, right? So the woman was released from jail, but was still referred to as Morningstar on September 16th when she was released over 2 weeks later and over a week after an article came out saying that her parents said that it wasn't Patty. So that tells me that her true identity wasn't discovered while she was in Idaho because
they're just going off of whatever name she gave.
Yeah. So like, I'm sure they did fingerprint her because, she was arrested, but I'm guessing that nothing came up. And it's 1990, so I don't know how good everything was nationwide at that point, how connected everything was.
Even if it was connected, it's 1989, 1990.
Or 1990, yeah.
1990 at this point. I mean, there's no guarantee that Patty had ever been fingerprinted.
I mean, if this was just some other random woman, right? There's nothing that would have said, yeah, she had been arrested for anything ever before. So, So her fingerprints very well wouldn't have come up in the system. So that could have just gone nowhere. And you're right, whether it's Patty or not. I just really find that interesting that it doesn't seem as though anyone actually figured out who that woman was or what happened to her after September 16th.
Yeah, that's weird.
Yes.
Like what's weird to me, like, I get it. The initial phone call, maybe it doesn't sound like her, but she's also been missing. Patty's been missing for a year at this point.
A year. So things can happen.
Yeah. Why wouldn't you, not that I'm blaming the parents, but like I would have taken a trip out there.
Yeah. So I just know if they weren't given that opportunity or, like what the actual circumstances were behind that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that I just really found interesting. And I really, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, because I did search and I could not find any original source that said that she had been
ruled out by fingerprints.
But again, Patty's loved ones were convinced that this woman was not Patty. So not only was Patty still missing, but this kind of brought up another terrifying possibility for her family, which was that this woman who'd been traveling and hitchhiking from Montana to Washington had actually been the one who sparked most, if not all, of the reported potential sightings of Patty in the first place. If this woman truly, truly was not Patty,
all of these sightings were a red herring.
Yeah. None of them could have been real, even these quote unquote confirmed ones.
Yeah.
So a whole year of sightings halfway across the country. I mean, by this point, we're in the hundreds. Could have all just been of somebody completely different.
That's wild.
Yeah. So what actually happened to Patricia Meehan? As I mentioned in the intro, her story is extremely similar to that of Hannah Upp. Hannah also went back near her home and evaded searchers. She was also with it enough to survive for weeks with nothing. Could Patty have done the same thing?
But she kind of came to at certain points. Hannah did.
Kind of, but not fully. And it really wasn't until after the first time she went missing, where she was gone for a couple of weeks and she ended up in the Hudson River and was pulled out, that she kind of like came back to herself in the hospital. But, if this is what happened to Patty and she never got that chance to be under medical supervision, I don't know. But I do find it interesting too that when Hannah went missing, she gravitated toward the water. Every time she went missing, she just like wanted to be near the water. And it seems like Patty just always wanted to be near diners, if these sightings are correct,
Yeah.
Or the other possibility is that Patty's story ended a lot sooner than the hundreds or thousands of sightings over the years would have you believe. The car crash that she was involved in was pretty serious. The other driver was injured, so it's likely that Patty was as well. The location of the crash was also extremely desolate. I found a post about this case on Reddit, and one user had some anecdotal evidence about the area, saying, quote, "I live not far from this location. The area is vast and desolate. Couple that with extreme weather and predatory animals, I would say she didn't last long out there by herself. Her remains could be scattered or still together, but in an area that literally no one would have a reason or want to check out. I've lived in the same spot for 16 years, and I could say with near 100% certainty that only a handful of people have accessed the land around me in all that time. It's posted no access for hunting, and there is nothing else around it, so people just don't come around. Wherever she ended up could be the same." End quote.
Montana is huge.
And, the terrain.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. I can't even imagine trying to find somebody. And yes, this person brings up a good point in that there are plenty of places around them where like people just don't go. But, where this person lives, there probably weren't search parties with ATVs and horses and helicopters, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But on the other hand, if there's private property along the area, like there is a possibility that was never searched.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
If there's private property that searchers couldn't or didn't want to get access to, a dazed, a confused Patty very easily could have ended up there.
Yeah.
And nobody would have known. Like if somebody has 100 acres of mostly wooded land, they're not necessarily visiting
all 197
of those acres or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I think it could be very possible.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, it's legit Wild West.
Yeah.
Like not cowboys, but
just untamed wilderness.
Yes. Yeah. Like untouched by humans.
Yeah.
That kind of untamed wilderness.
And, I think it's hard for me because we cover a lot of cases where people go missing in like urban or suburban areas where there are like 4 trees and they're like, oh, they just disappeared. But in a place like this, I think that makes a lot more sense where you can have these extensive searches and still very easily miss someone.
Yeah, for sure. We've seen it in cases in Washington too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
They go wander into the forest in Washington state, and that's basically a jungle.
Yeah. Wisconsin. You go into these places and you can't see 2 feet in front of you.
Right.
I totally understand that, but there were just so many sightings too.
Yeah.
That did that happen, and were those sightings red herrings, or were those sightings of Morningstar, and was Morningstar actually Patty somehow?
Yeah, who knows? Maybe it's less of a Hannah Up situation and more of a Lawrence Bader situation where there was some sort of amnesia that kind of created a different, I don't want to say personality, but
identity.
a different identity in her own head.
No, and that's a theory that's been thrown out there as well. There was like a whole section on the Web Sleuths forum about that they thought that she was this other woman. But yeah, I mean,
there's no evidence of it, of
right,
course.
It's so hard because it's just like there's so many insane possibilities in this story.
Yeah. It's still so creepy.
It is. It has been decades since Patty walked away from the side of the road that evening in 1989. Several Jane Does have been ruled out as being Patty over the years, and despite the quote-unquote confirmed sightings, no one truly knows if Patty ever made it out of Circle, Montana. Her family searched for her for decades, and her father told reporters that he held out hope that they would be reunited, but said, quote, "Doing something like this is really hard. It's like chasing the wind," end quote. Patricia Meehan has been missing from Circle, Montana since April 20th, 1989. She's a white woman with brown hair and green-gray eyes and freckles. She was last seen wearing a brown coat, jeans, high-top sneakers, and carrying a leather purse. She was 5'3" and approximately 100 to 117 pounds at the time of her disappearance. Patty was 37 when she went missing. She would be 73 today. Anyone with information regarding Patricia Meehan's disappearance should contact the McCone County Sheriff's Office at 406-485-3405. You can see all the sources for this episode along with photos and videos at our website, andthentheywere.gone.com.
And be sure to follow us on social, And Then They Were Gone Pod on Facebook and at ATTWG Pod on Instagram and TikTok. If you like what we're doing, please subscribe and consider leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It will help new listeners find us. And the more people that listen, the more chances we have of bringing someone home.
And we'll see you here next week for a brand new episode.
See you next week.
And Then They Were Gone is hosted by Kona Gallagher and Ethan Flick. Research, writing, and editing is done by me, Kona Gallagher, with additional research by Nikki Elmas. Theme music is The Stork by Ketsa. Additional music is provided by Kai Engel. And Then They Were Gone is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!